I take testimony today from those who are opposed, who have signed up in opposition to House Bill 166. That would be Chris Coron, Tommy Loving, Sean Butler, Dr. Dinesh Mazlamudus, Sheriff Keith Kane. That's it. Right. Any or all of you can approach the bench. So yesterday's panel went about 35 minutes, so we'll grant you all the same amount of time. And I will begin with the first one who signed up, Chris Coron.
And if it's okay with the chairman, I'm going to let Sheriff Kane start for our group, and then we'll proceed from there.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Sheriff. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to voice the concerns of Kentucky sheriffs, as well as many in the law enforcement community concerning this proposed legislation. The idea of the authority of the FDA in regulating smokable marijuana as medicine by popular vote, although for the very best of intentions, I believe is unwise and, quite frankly, irresponsible. It ignores the correlation between marijuana use and crime, the inevitable trafficking problem that would be created across state and local boundaries as a result of that legalization, and the potential economic and social costs that would thusly be incurred. Communities have been crippled by drug abuse and addiction, stifling economic productivity. Specifically, marijuana's harmful effects can include episodes of depression, psychosis, impaired cognitive abilities, attention deficit issues, and it has been documented as well as my own observation through over 4 decades in law enforcement that is indeed often a gateway drug to other drugs of abuse. Marijuana use has had devastating effects in our communities nationally, with over 8,000 drugged driving deaths a year. Many of those involved marijuana use. I can tell you that 3 of those marijuana-involved fatalities occurred in my county in the span of 1 year. Reviews of prescription data in states that have legalized marijuana for medical purposes show that it's not primarily prescribed for people in intense pain or who are terminally ill. In Colorado, for example, those reviews show only 2% of the people who have been prescribed marijuana are terminally ill cancer patients. There, 94% of the people who have received marijuana prescriptions cited, quote, unspecified pain, end quote. I have tried throughout the medical community to get a definitive definition of that term, and I've yet to find one. And in California, reviews have shown that primarily young men with no life-threatening illnesses are the ones using medical marijuana. What we've seen in these other states is that people in the final stages of terminal illness and fighting pain aren't the ones that are smoking this medical marijuana. These prescriptions appear to be handed out indiscriminately, many of them to young people. Officials have also documented major increases in illicit exports of marijuana from these medical dispensaries in Colorado and other states post-medicalization legislation. Indeed, much of that marijuana has made its way across the heartland right here into our Commonwealth. Know this, my opposition to this legislation isn't because I lack compassion for the sick, but because I think it's wrong to herald marijuana, which has many proven negative qualities and not yet been proven to be medically beneficial. 2, there are numerous studies and reports by respected entities. These include the National Academy of Science, the Institute of Medicine, the FDA, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, and the American Psychiatric Association, and many others, which have repeatedly concluded that little scientific evidence supporting marijuana in its natural form as a medicine. Certainly, marijuana as medicine does not involve smoking marijuana. It involves exploiting the potential in cannabinoids, that is, the chemical compounds that are the active ingredients in the marijuana plant. THC is already legally available as an oral prescription drug in Marinol and the equivalent spray, Senovex, to treat the ailments that marijuana is reported to help relieve the symptoms for, including cancer, AIDS, neurological disorders, and inflammatory pain. These FDA-approved drugs provide better treatment for all these ailments, and smoking marijuana, as we all know, can damage the lungs, immune systems, and brains of longtime users. Consider this. It took us over 5 decades and millions of dollars in research invested in research before we here in Kentucky finally decided that smoking tobacco will probably kill you. One of the proposed uses is also post-traumatic stress disorder. Although clinical and psychiatric experts from the Louisville Veterans Affairs Medical Center cautioned this very body, the Kentucky legislature, in July 2014 over a lack of controlled drug trials and clinical evidence for treating PTSD patients with marijuana, despite anecdotal evidence. Marijuana use accounts for tens of thousands of marijuana-related complaints at emergency rooms throughout the United States each year. Over 99,000 of those, unfortunately, are our young people. Despite arguments by the drug culture to the contrary, marijuana is indeed an addictive drug. The levels of THC, that is marijuana's psychoactive ingredient, have never been higher than they are today. This is a major factor why marijuana is the #1 drug causing young people to enter treatment and why there has been a substantial increase in the people in treatment for marijuana dependence. Employees who test positive for marijuana had 55% more industrial accidents and 85% more injuries, and they had an absentee rate 75% higher than those who tested negative for the drug. This damages our economy. The argument that we can tax and regulate marijuana and derive income from it, unfortunately, is unfounded. The increased use will increase the multitude of costs that come with marijuana use. The costs from health and mental wellness problems, vehicle accidents, and damage to our economic productivity will far outstrip any tax obtained. Our economy is already suffering. The last thing we need is the burden of this legislation that would put on us. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, know this. Our kids, your kids, are sensitive to norms, so they feel that marijuana is harmful. That consumption goes down. Medicalization of marijuana sends the very opposite message. Relaxed marijuana legislation sends a public message that the drug is safe and a sure prescription for increased use, particularly by our young people. The conclusion that can be drawn from these facts is that relaxed marijuana policies lead to a clear and a foreseeable negative consequences for communities and our families. Residents of Kentucky with legitimate illnesses deserve safe and effective medications, not a cancer-causing toxic weed that does more harm than it does good. Labeling pot as medicine will create a dangerous illusion that is safe and will be devastatingly harmful to the children of this Commonwealth. Finally, in testimony yesterday, you heard of a University of Georgia study published in the Journal of American Medical Association's Journal, quoting a 25% reduction in opioid overdoses in states that had passed similar legislation as that is being proposed here today. I've read that report in its entirety because, like you, that's a very, very appealing statistic. The lead researcher, Professor Douglas Bruce, is quoted in that study thusly, and I quote, "The lack of provider knowledge around what cannabis does and doesn't do, the difference in products and ingestion methods and dosing is all kind of a wild west," end quote. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the way I interpret that, what we don't know is equally important, and I would argue is even more important than what we think we do know. We do wisely, you would do wisely, to tread lightly until further research can adequately address all these issues. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Sheriff. Chris.
And next, with the chair's permission, I'm going to turn it over to the doctor, to his time.
Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you.
Please proceed.
Thank you for having me. My name is Danish Mazembeus. I'm a physician in Lexington, Kentucky, and my focus is on pain, but regenerative options for pain rather than just opioid management and symptom mitigation. As a native Kentuckian and a physician, I've previously testified to this body as a representative of Kentucky physicians. The term medical marijuana continues to be used as a political platform for legalization of marijuana. This is a dangerous notion and disingenuous use of the term medical. Every medicine currently used in healthcare has specific doses with studies on how much to use, for whom, for what, and most importantly, its harms. Marijuana has none of these guidelines. No medication on the market is a complex compound of over 500 molecules with nearly 100 that have bioactive properties, meaning they have an impact on the body. There's no consistency in the ratios of the bioactive chemicals from dose to dose. Calling marijuana medicine mislabels what medicine is and creates the illusion of scientific rigor that underlies the field of medicine as a profession. This is a complex argument, and even the AMA agrees that there is substantial evidence that specific molecules within marijuana have medical properties. However, physicians as a whole are not going to label the black box of marijuana as medicine. The known medical properties of singular compounds within marijuana are also found in related plants like hemp. But why is there no lobby for medical hemp? CBD, for instance, is found in much higher concentrations in hemp than in marijuana, and CBD is the same bioactive chemical that is of great interest in marijuana. Kentucky is lucky in that we have a pilot program on hemp, which gives access to many of the same medical properties of marijuana with fewer harms. There are local hemp farmers and producers that market derivative products from hemp that have shown medical value, the same ones popularized in the media for marijuana. And hemp has just as much economic potential as marijuana. In fact, there was yet another cannabidiol factory announced in western Kentucky yesterday. The hemp derivatives, however, lack the chemicals that are sought after in recreational use of marijuana, namely THC. The reason that there isn't a movement for medicalizing hemp is the same reason there isn't a strong lobby for recreational hemp. We know that even medically prescribed products, when liberalized, will make it into the hands of the general public. This was indeed the case with opioids, which had a one-to-one correlation between volume prescribed and rates of addiction and overdose. Opioids were sold with the same arguments currently being made across the country for marijuana, to ease people's suffering, that it's inhumane to hold it back. And look at where that got us. When opioids were first being pushed, much of the data quoted were extreme extrapolations and misrepresentations of studies looking at opioids for specific scenarios like trauma, surgery, or terminal cancer pain. These were not the same conditions as what ended up being the mainstay for what opioids were used for, musculoskeletal pain. Just as how we are justifying marijuana for everything when really the studies are looking at one of the 500 compounds in marijuana at a time. The studies on opioid safety were equally marginalized or devalued. We can see what a catastrophic failure that was in treating pain. We shouldn't make the same mistake of jumping to conclusions ahead of science when it comes to marijuana. I'd also like to dispel the notion that there are only two options when treating chronic pain, opioids or marijuana. We all share the blame in a broken way we've tried to fix pain with pills. I find it frustrating that the conversation around pain continues to be so limited. You'll never cure pain with a pill. Pain is like a check engine light telling us something is broken. Whether it's marijuana or opioids, the most that a pill can do is dim that light for short spans. It's not going to turn it off or fix the engine. Without identifying the mechanical breakdown and addressing it, the dysfunction will continue, light or no light. So why are we focused on turning off the light instead of fixing the engine? I can assure you there are far more treatment options for pain that a well-versed specialist can provide than just writing for one of two medications. There's also an argument that marijuana reduces the number of opioid prescriptions and overdoses. Well, so does buprenorphine, ketamine, and other hemp-derived CBD products. All are medications with greater track record of efficacy than marijuana has as a plant. But access to these can sometimes be more restrictive due to regulations than access to marijuana. Addiction is not an area of medicine that we need more options. It's an area of medicine that needs more access to well-vetted options we already have. Leveraging an existing addiction epidemic does not rationalize opening Pandora's box by mainstreaming another psychoactive product. As far as overdoses go, there are some misunderstandings here as well. Opioid overdose means respiratory failure. Tylenol overdose means liver failure. Ibuprofen overdose means kidney failure. Overdose doesn't necessarily mean death. It just means a serious harm. There are indeed evidence of harms with marijuana overdose, and it's well documented, particularly as dabbing has become more common and THC levels of marijuana have gone up. Psychosis, hyperemesis or never-ending nausea, vomiting, amotivational syndrome or generalized apathy and loss of interest are all adverse outcomes of marijuana overuse and overdose. They may not be as dramatic as respiratory failure with opioids, but they still harm in a slower way. And there's ample anecdotal evidence of someone functioning with marijuana dependency, as there are anecdotal evidence of smoking without cancer or drinking alcohol without addiction. But for those who are vulnerable, shouldn't we have a better screening method or identification? And wouldn't it be better to have the same benefits without the harms? The reduction in opioid overdoses assumes a one-to-one replacement of marijuana for opioid. But we also know that most opioid overdoses are not just opioids, they're a combination of drugs. And who's to say that marijuana won't necessarily increase that? We also saw a dip in opioid overdoses when House Bill 1 passed in 2012. There were fewer opioid prescriptions, but then all of a sudden we saw a dramatic rise in fentanyl overdoses, and that trend continues. The observational evidence that marijuana reduces overdoses is based on very recent data spanning a very short time frame. Similar to extrapolated trends we made with opioids, we don't yet know what this will lead us into. But we do know that marijuana potentiates opioid potency. I have a colleague down in University of Mississippi, Dr. Sufka, who studies marijuana and a lot of the derivatives of marijuana. They've shown that even small additions can increase the potency of opioids, which has two points. One is that, yes, it could be used in reducing pain, but it also increases the risks of overdose. Their lab has also found synthetic CBD, one that they've created in the lab that has greater benefit for pain than marijuana does. Why not use the best of a plant and exclude the worst? I won't go into detail about the risks and adverse outcomes seen in states that have legalized marijuana for medicine or recreational use. But there haven't been any studies since I did this testimonial last year that would recant the statistics that I did mention or as law enforcement has mentioned. It bears to mention that the use of marijuana does have dire impacts on adolescents, and states with some form of legalized marijuana show higher rates of adolescent use. We see this trend with opioids as well, that communities in which they are prescribed more show more teenage use of opioids. The functions and neural connections of our brain don't fully develop until people hit their mid-20s. So marijuana use in adolescence has substantial evidence of harm. Children who are born to mothers who use marijuana unquestionably have lower birth weights and health problems. And there is substantial evidence of psychoses developing in frequent users, but increasingly in adolescents. There's a lot of evidence that marijuana increases motor accidents and the fatality of accidents involving marijuana. I mention all of these because the allure of tax revenue generated by legalization is rapidly offset by the societal costs. Alcohol and tobacco taxes never come close to the societal costs that they impose, and the difference is approximately 16-fold. But this is easy to ignore since the revenue is realized now, but the societal cost is recognized later, much as it was with opioids. There's a valid reason why physicians or medical providers who prescribe drugs have a strong vetting process through proper channels to understand how a drug works and where its uses are. There are currently studies in their final stages looking at some of the marijuana derivatives that we anticipate seeing in the near future. In the meantime, there are nutraceuticals with CBD available on the market for conditions that people are eager to try marijuana. Combined with the cannabinoids that are currently available by prescription, I don't really see the value of adding marijuana, a product that we have little information about the long-term use of and potential harms. The push for medical marijuana is a Trojan horse, and we've seen special interests before who've leveraged vulnerable populations with faulty science and unsubstantiated claims resulting in large-scale problems. Opioid and nicotine are just two examples. Titling this lobby effort as medical marijuana subtly builds a perspective on marijuana that it is safe and condoned by physicians. Let me be clear. Sound, scientifically minded physicians do not endorse marijuana as medicine, but we also don't deny the potential for specific molecules within marijuana to have medical benefit. We ought to downregulate marijuana and hemp derivatives from Schedule I to Schedule II, making research and progress more practical in this arena. We have no evidence that adding the native drug of marijuana adds any gains to already existing products, but we do have existence of harm. If you're going to call something medicine, then allow it to be done by the scientists, not those in business. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Before we call the next witness, I'm going to ask our doorkeeper to contact building maintenance and ask them if they can lower the temperature in here in this room.
I thought it was just me.
No.
Please proceed.
Kentucky Association of Chiefs of Police is honored to submit this testimony to the Kentucky House of Representatives Judiciary Committee and Chairman Fisher to officially state the organization's opposition to House Bill 166. On January 18th of this year, during a KACP general membership meeting, the KACP unanimously adopted a resolution to oppose legalizing the sale, distribution, and possession of medical and recreational marijuana, hashish, and marijuana concentrate, and products made from marijuana concentrates. Above all, the KACP is committed to the health and welfare of the citizens of Kentucky and will not, in good conscience, support legislation to allow the distribution and sale of medical marijuana when the distribution and possession of marijuana is illegal under state and federal law. KACP is also greatly concerned about the risk of marijuana and the potential proliferation of its use under this bill. Studies from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, Office of Applied Science, have established that marijuana, like cigarettes, is addictive. Research has also established that marijuana use is harmful to the adolescent brain, affecting memory, thinking, pleasure, concentration, learning, sensory and time perception, as well as coordinated movement. And the higher potency of today's marijuana may be contributing to the substantial increase in the number of teenagers and adults in treatment for marijuana dependency. Marijuana has a tremendous negative impact on our society and our state. Adults who use marijuana are 5 times more likely to develop an alcohol problem, and our members and their officers witness this well-documented threat to public safety caused by the drug use, including marijuana, in terms of highway safety, criminal activity, and domestic violence. In conclusion, the KACP believes that the effort to legalize marijuana is contrary to the public health, safety, and welfare of Kentucky citizens and desires to preserve the rights of citizens to live and work in a community where drug abuse is not accepted and citizens are not subjected to the adverse effects of drug abuse. Thank you for allowing the KACP to submit this testimony to the honorable members of this House Judiciary Committee.
Let's see. Good afternoon. Tommy Loving, Executive Director for the Kentucky Narcotic Officers Association, representing over 400 drug enforcement officers across the state. And just as a point, heard some testimony that some law enforcement were in favor of this. Our 400-plus members unanimously voted last year and year before to oppose the legalization of medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. Kentucky is a poor state, 25% on Medicaid, and as I understand this bill, this would allow anyone with a card to grow 12 plants. Well, 12 plants correlates roughly into 12 pounds of harvested marijuana. And I just can't imagine what disability you'd need 12 pounds of marijuana at in any given time. All states that now have recreational marijuana started with medical. I also understand there's a provision in here that state and local law enforcement cannot investigate an individual because they have a marijuana card and cannot assist a federal agency with an investigation. While that may be well intended and whatnot. But I think any good defense lawyer, that will be the first defense they raise for a marijuana trafficker. Card holders can share marijuana. You know, if this is supposed to be medicine, then I guess it'd be okay to share opiates. I think there's a definite correlation there. Also, as I understand, caregivers can procure marijuana for the patient, and the caregiver doesn't necessarily have to even be a relative. Well, the people we deal with usually find a way around things, so there will be caregivers, if this happens, out selling marijuana they procured on the pretense of getting it for a patient. I think we've already talked about the harmful effects of marijuana on the adolescents, so I'll try not to belabor that. Columbia University recently completed a study that residents of states with medical marijuana had marijuana abuse and dependency rates almost twice as high as states without such laws. And we touched on the opiates. In 2011, in Kentucky, there were 371 million opiates distributed in this state. In 2016, we were down to 301, about a 20% decrease. I think this body deserves part of that credit. I think the physicians deserve a lot of that credit for understanding the prescribing habits that were out of control. And we did all that without medical marijuana. So I'm certainly not at all sure there's a correlation with medical marijuana decreasing opiate use. And to that point, a recently published article in the American Psychiatric Association, and just to give you quickly the conclusion, cannabis appears to increase rather than decrease the risk of developing non-medical prescription opiate use and opiate use disorder. We've touched, Colorado's seen 114% increase on marijuana-related fatality accidents. I have a lengthy article here from the Denver Post touting all this, the problem there. And then one other point I wanted to make before I finish, a recent study or control studies have not concluded the evaluation of the safety or effectiveness of medical marijuana for PSD. And I'm sorry, this is published by the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. Thus, there is no evidence at this time that marijuana is an effective treatment for PTSD. In fact, research suggests that marijuana can be harmful to individuals with PTSD. So thank you for allowing us to speak today on behalf of the Kentucky Narcotic Officers, over 400 members. And we will continue to object to this for the safety of the Commonwealth, and hope that you can help us in this matter.
Thank you. Chris, do you have something to add here?
Just briefly, my name is Chris Goron. I'm the Legislative Director for Kentucky's Commonwealth Attorneys Association, along with Rob Sanders, the Commonwealth Attorney from Kenton County. We again, on behalf of our association, would ask for this body to oppose the legalization of both medical and recreational marijuana. As we've looked at this throughout the years, no other legitimate drug is given in a dosage unit such as a joint, a puff, or a bowl. No other medical legitimate medicine has such names as green crack, poochie love, dopium, or purple urkel. This is what's going to be described as medicine in these days and times. As Commonwealth Attorney in Warren County, we handle over 1,000 indictments every year. We are at the front line of dealing with the results of the hard work of law enforcement when they end up in the criminal justice system. One thing a lot of you all that are practicing attorneys know, that at the end of a case, when we see a precedence investigation provided to us by the Department of Probation and Parole, we get to see the life history of the defendant, the life history of the defendant, and what got them into the Department of Corrections. And I can say without question and without rare exception, marijuana is a gateway drug in the criminal justice system that led so many individuals down a path of incarceration, desperation, and addiction that we cannot stand for. We stand willing to work with this body, as we have continued to do, on criminal justice reforms, on looking at all the different avenues of looking at the controlled substances issues that we've looked at over the last decade. However, we would again submit to you all that medical marijuana is a fool's gold, that if you look at the research, you look at the other states that have gone down this road, it has failed miserably. I've also served, and I'm currently the past director of Appalachia HIDA in our board. Unfortunately, Kentucky is designated as one of 32 areas in the United States as a HIDA jurisdiction, high-intensity drug trafficking areas. I've met with my colleagues all over the United States, including colleagues from states that have gone down the road of medical marijuana, as well as decriminalization and legalizing marijuana. And I can tell you this is a road we do not want to go down. I understand we're running short on time and there's other measures for this body to consider, but we would ask for the defeat of this measure.
Thank you. Representative Birch has a question. 2 questions.
Attendance was marijuana caused attendance problems at work. I had a responsibility for 2,600 people, and that was not a problem with our attendance problem. In fact, people showed up. We had farmers also work for us, and they were bringing the marijuana in, so people came there. So they came there and worked, and we put out a pretty good product too, as a matter of fact. The question is, what's the relationship, or what's the percentage of drunk drivers do you pick up versus marijuana drivers? Anybody can answer that?
It's very difficult to tell, Representative Birch, because there is no definitive test for determining the content of THC as there is with alcohol, and therein itself is a hurdle that law enforcement would have to contend with if this was passed. I can only tell you what we see in Davis County. That percentage, I'd be reluctant to tell you without checking, but it's in comparison with marijuana, with alcohol, probably considerably, most definitely considerably less, and probably somewhere in the 10 or 20 percentile range. But that is just an estimate, sir.
I mean, what we're seeing more and more are polysubstance DUIs. You're seeing a mixture of alcohol as well as marijuana and other controlled substances.
But you don't have a way to measure it right now, is that right?
You can measure THC content in blood alcohol. However, Kentucky has chosen not to have a per se violation for DUI with marijuana in the system.
I mean, marijuana, I mean, if they legalize the medical part of it, any of y'all doctors?
Yes,
sir.
If they legalize the medical part of it, how much will that increase marijuana use?
I don't know if there's a way to
Because
tell.
they're already smoking it.
Right. I don't know if legalizing it, if there's a way to tell how much it'll go up, but we do know that economic studies have shown that legalization increases its use widespread, and it doesn't reduce the number of black market available products, because there's always going to be somebody who's going to try to circumvent the tax revenue.
One other statement, Mr. Chairman, if I might.
Just one more.
Thank you, sir. Back in the 20s and 30s, we had something called prohibition. I lived back in that time, so I can talk a little bit about it. And also voted to criminalize marijuana back in '78. I think it was a stupid vote, but we did it anyway. But it caused the rise of the mafia in the United States. Now we got drugs that cause the rise of crime in the United States. And we can't beat other countries that have legalized it and got rid of the problem. Here we continue to do the negative stuff, and it gets worse. So I would look for solutions to try to keep people from using these drugs and start pushing for legislation in that area. But I don't see where medical marijuana is going to increase or decrease one person in this state, because they're already doing this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I would say it's going to make marijuana more readily available to everyone, particularly our teens, and I don't want my grandkids growing up around more marijuana than what's out there now.
How are you going to stop them?
so far have done okay, but it's a
If they're
scary
5 years
world.
old.
Yes, sir.
Representative Sinet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Isn't it feasible to say that alcohol is a gateway to drugs?
I think any psychoactive chemical is a gateway, but you also have to consider that with alcohol being legal, we have such high teen uses. If we're legalizing yet another psychoactive property, are you suggesting that it would be less? Because I would argue that the rates of alcohol are not going to go down in teenage use, and in fact, we're going to get an additional psychoactive compound out there that's going to increase in use.
Okay, I guess my point being is that I've always, let me back up a little bit. My mother, God bless her heart, she's 90 years old, and she started an oncology unit at King's Daughters Medical Center back home in Ashland, Kentucky. And unfortunately, I had a sister that died about 6-7 years ago of liver cancer. And talking to her oncologist, and due to my mother's experience, rarely does a patient die of the cancer itself, but the issues that surround the cancer, the ravages that take place with chemotherapy. But a lot of times, more times than not, an oncologist actually told me, and was educated in Houston, which is premier in liver cancer, that malnutrition ends up it's what gets the patient. And having said that, marijuana or cannabis, whatever you want to call it, in my mother's experience of all of her years, said that was one of the biggest things that helped in getting an individual to eat. It had medicinal values as opposed to alcohol, which, from what we understand, depending on what day you read, does have medicinal values, whether it's a glass of wine or not. But when you talk about fetal alcohol syndrome, alcohol is legal when we have babies being born with fetal alcohol syndrome. I'm just having difficulty. I'm having an open mind. I don't know whether we're fighting the demonization and the reputation that cannabis has had on us for the last 100 years, and instead of looking at the possibilities of an organic substance that could help with someone's pain or give them the ability to at least have some life by eating. I saw my sister die. She couldn't eat. And I heard the doctor himself say, my mother asked, and the doctor confirmed marijuana does stimulate the appetite. And nutrition is what gets the patients in a large aspect. I do have questions in regard to, how do you regulate this? When the federal government is against this, does the federal government come in and say, no, you can't do this? At what point in time that they do that? And I think probably everybody in this room wants to have an open mind and wants to have medication to help people. I think that when we stepped on the prescription drugs, we had 100 other drugs come to its funeral, and one of them was heroin, fentanyl. You look at all these other things that happen when we take the opioids, and I'm grappling with the issue of what lobbying groups are so much against this, whether it is, and I'm not saying, law enforcement it's fantastic, but we know that once this is out of the arena, and someone's using this for medicinal purposes, it's out of the arena. Is it the pharmaceutical companies that are engaged in creating chemical drugs and don't want this to be a medicine to help in whatever aspect? Do we have counselors that, well, this is a third of our practices is going to go away because the judicial system has sent them to be counseled in marijuana use? And sometimes I wonder where this is all going, as we're not looking at really the control aspect and whether or not this is a potential actually drug that can be used to help with pain and have a legitimate purpose. This is coming from my 90-year-old mother who started oncology unit in a hospital, because she's done so much research on it, whether it could be in, what is it, a vapor? Can it be in some type of ointment that can be rubbed on? Can it be put into a pill format to where it stimulates the appetite? I do have a lot of questions in regard to that because it just seems like I know a lot of kids, and I'm not saying that I'm innocent myself, that drank underage, and here we have a legal, non-medicinal item out there that I truly believe causes more harm in families, that causes domestic abuse, and I haven't really seen a lot of domestic abuse surrounding marijuana. But then again, it's illegal, and it's usually the young individual that is using that recreationally. And I think we're getting tied up and getting mixed up in what is recreational versus what is medicinal. But I just wanted to say that do you see any medicinal value in marijuana or none at all?
Can I comment on it, Representative? Absolutely, sir. I think that anecdotally speaking, and I'm sure there's many stories in this room today, anecdotally, that they have seen positive results from utilizing that. But in comparing that with all the studies out there and what all we know in terms of the negative side effects, in balancing those, I most definitely think that there is medicinal properties of marijuana, but I think it lies in these cannabinoids and the studies that need to be done there. I do not think, and I don't think you could convince me that overall across the spectrum that smoking it as a drug under uncontrolled conditions is the way that we should head. And as I understand this legislation, that's the path we're heading down. I'm very empathetic to the people in this room and the stories that you have heard. I hear those on a regular basis from my constituents also. But I don't think smoking the drug is the answer to the question, sir. And with regards to your issue of alcohol causing more problems, it goes back to Representative Birch's question. It does, and it does so because it's a legal drug. And any time the drug is more available, then the negativisms associated in our society rises dramatically with that. The more of a drug that's available, regardless of what the drug is, the more abuse and potential for the abuse. There's a direct correlation there.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Representative Nemes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you guys for coming. I know a number of you guys have identified some of the problems that I have with a particular bill. But I did want to note that I think this is an extremely tough question for me. When I ran for office, I was an automatic no. I started meeting with constituents out of respect for them and listening to them, and they told me how it worked for them. They told me how it worked for their children. And so I started to have an open mind, open heart, and those were anecdotal stories, so that wasn't going to change my mind. But I went to a bunch of studies. I called a number of doctors that I know and a number of doctors that I don't know, and they're split. Now, the Kentucky Medical Association is against it. I want to say that. I know the nurses are for it. I think the American Medical Association is against it, and I trust our docs. But I called a number of them, and they were split. The ones I called down the middle, I called over 12. But then I read a bunch of the studies, and I know it hadn't been studied enough, but it hadn't been studied because it's a Schedule I. And what I found is the Minnesota Department of Health says Results are clinically significant and promising for both pain treatment and reducing opioid dependence. They found that 63% reduction, or 63% of the people in the study, reduced their use or ended their use of opioids. University of Michigan found 64% reduced. The University of California, Berkeley, which I normally don't trust, they say 97%. I think that may have been written by some proponents on that one. The Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA, study says the overdose rates for opioids, which you guys all know you fight every single day. It's in our families, it's in our communities everywhere. They found a 25% reduction in overdose for opioids. That wasn't the only one. The RAND study finds very similar reduction in opioids. Israel is a big proponent, a big exporter of medical marijuana, the smokable kind. And we trust Israel as a legitimate health country with health services, health apparatus. Columbia University says that medical marijuana does not lead to recreational use. In fact, the statement that there appears to be no basis for the argument that legalizing medical marijuana has increased teens' use of the drug. That's a lady named Deborah Hassan, who's a doctor of epidemiology at Columbia. And so I read those studies, and I talk to my docs back home, and I look at, and I meet with my constituents, and I'm thinking, who the heck do we think we are as a government to keep this away from people if it helps them? But I also want to note that I don't want, and I believe Mr. Coron when he says it's a gateway drug. There's no doubt in my mind. But it's also an off-ramp for people with opioid addictions. And so while I struggled, I'm not struggling anymore. I support medical marijuana in Kentucky. I think it's time for medical marijuana in Kentucky. I think this bill needs some significant improvements. I've met with my friend Representative Sims and told him that, and so I'm gonna have to vote no on this bill. But I'm for it. It's time in Kentucky that we move forward, and maybe if we can make some of these changes, that we can, like for instance, the growing 12 plants at one time, and that's not something I can support. But I think I would like for us to get together and create something in Kentucky that we can get behind that would help our people and not lead to the gateway as much as what you guys are talking about. But I want to thank you guys for coming. You've identified a lot of the problems with the bill that I've had, but I do think this is good for our people, and I support it, the effort going forward. That's not a question, Mr. Chairman. I apologize.
All right. Representative Benvenuti.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, my questions are for you, I believe. Are you aware of any other medicine that has not received FDA approval, but whose approval comes from politicians?
None.
So in the history of the United States, you're not aware of any other medicine that has been approved solely by politicians?
No.
If you would, you talked about hemp and the compounds. Are you aware of any compound that shows any potential benefit, understanding that it requires more study? And you articulated many medical groups who say we need to study. We don't need to treat this as a medicine. We need to study it. But are you aware of anything out there that says that it's the THC compound that's of medical benefit?
There are, I won't say that there isn't evidence of THC having some medicinal value, but the range of dosage that has value versus has harm is a very it's a large differential. There's a lot more benefit known for CBD, and I can't stress enough that it is available. I mean, people have access to it. But for THC, we have a much narrower window of value.
And that's kind of a good lead into my next question, so I appreciate that. And that is, every medicine I'm aware of comes with dosing information and information on what's contraindicated. Are you aware in any state that has legalized so-called medical marijuana that it has come with dosing information and, importantly, strength information? Because it's my understanding that THC levels can vary greatly.
No, absolutely not.
Are you aware of any drug currently available that does not contain dosing or strength information?
Every drug that we use has some information about how that medication affects the body when it leaves the body, and what things can it harm.
And one more question, if I could, Sharon. Thank you. PTSD, I think, is a topic that requires a lot of discussion. I watched what I thought was a very informative movie this weekend with my son called "Thank You for Your Service," and I think it does a very good job at articulating how our country has not done a good job, not even close to it, in my opinion, with making sure that returning veterans are properly cared for. But I think the problem with the lack of research is this. I have folks come to me that say this would be good for veterans. I've had psychiatrists come to me and say, if you approve this, you will increase the suicide rate of veterans because it's a depressant and you're making depressed people more depressed. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. So lack of mental health resources is not a surrogate. Marijuana is not a surrogate for lack of mental health resources. And there's no debate that mental health resources are deficient in this country, absolutely. THC actually has been studied as having some value for PTSD, but again, the window of opportunity is very, very tight, and we know that it's not as effective as when CBD is added to it. But to what levels or what dosages, we have no idea. And yes, it does have harms because THC, while it is a depressant initially, when it starts to wean out of the body, it'll actually activate and be an adjutant. We don't have the pharmacokinetics of THC. We don't know how much is absorbed and how much is slowly released over time and at what rate. And it varies from person to person. So we can't even say ballpark that this is how much you should take and this is when you should take it. Consider that this is a drug that has therapeutic value, but marginally going outside of that line has potential for tremendous harm. These are not questions that we should be debating on a political platform. It's a question that we need to be debating on a medical platform.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Moser.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate all of your testimony. I appreciate the folks who came yesterday. I think that this is a very valuable conversation, and it's one that our constituents are very concerned about. Anecdotally, we hear, how this has really helped individuals, but, I am concerned about the lack of science, and this is, really a recurring theme when we talk about medical marijuana. Can you talk a little bit, Dr. Moslem-Doust, about some of the clinical trials, the hemp clinical trials that are being done now, and some of the medications that have come from those?
Yes, in fact, at University of Louisville, Dr. Schaefer has been looking at CBD derivatives to treat childhood seizures since 2014. At the University of Kentucky, there's ongoing research about hemp production, the safe pesticides that we can use, the best harvest protocols. These are methodologies to extract the highest concentration of the beneficial products from hemp and marijuana-derived entities without as much of the harms. And to circumvent all of that fantastic research being done and try to bulldog this through, I think, is a mistake. If you think about the opioid epidemic, if we go back 20, 30 years, there was just as much controversy and debate as to what the value of this is. And if you look back, those who were specialized in the arena of pain versus those who were just general practitioners, there's a big discrepancy in the opinions that are out there. And there are far more general practitioners than there are specialists. So you can see where the confusion can come.
Right. Thank you. If I may,
Certainly.
I just have a couple of really comments. There are no other plants really that we, other nutraceuticals that we can get over the counter, and they're not FDA approved. So we really, again, don't know what we're getting. but marijuana as a plant really is a misnomer because, or medical marijuana really is a misnomer because marijuana is a plant. And I've said this before, but we don't chew willow bark for aspirin, and we don't chew digitalis for digoxin or our heart medications. And we all know what an opioid problem we have, but we don't chew poppy for our pain control. What I'm saying is we do have a process. We have the FDA process to really research and derive and extract the compounds that we need to really pay attention to and use for creating these medications. We do have some great medications that are being derived from hemp, and I think probably among the 500 compounds that we know that are available in marijuana, we certainly are going to be able to derive something that can be, maybe we'll cure cancer, but we need to be able to research it. So, I think that while we anecdotally hear that marijuana is kind of this cure-all for all of these diseases that are listed in this bill, I think that there are a great number that could potentially be toxic, and you don't want to use the entire compound when only a few are really the active ingredients that you need. Also, just in discussing HIDA and the high-intensity drug trafficking areas, I was able to bring HIDA to Northern Kentucky. I know what a problem we have in our state. I also read Rocky Mountain HIDA report because it's just really fun to read that. No, I'm teasing. It is very interesting to understand really what's going on in other states. And I think that we can learn a lot from other states who have legalized marijuana either medically or recreationally. We do see in Colorado and California an increase in younger usage. I think down to the average age of 12 and 13. That is really scary to me, to introduce yet another intoxicant as a normalized coping mechanism. And I think that we can all see and we all understand that we have a severe opioid issue and a very addicted population. And, I have a problem with normalizing intoxicants as a coping mechanism when we really should be focusing more on building resilience in kids, and there are ways to positively do that without introducing yet another intoxicant. So I think this is a very good discussion. I'm really in favor of more research. There are good things to come, I think, and we are seeing that in our clinical trials, but I'm not sure that this is the answer. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Representative Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been a very helpful discussion.
Get real close. Get real close to the mic.
Like Representative Lemus, I think I'm a little more confused than I was when I walked in. But I did hear somebody talk about opiate disorder. Is there such thing as marijuana disorder? Is there a diagnosis of that?
There is. I think that there is some controversy around that because some would argue that there isn't an addiction with marijuana, but there is ample evidence that the body does form a physiologic dependency to marijuana, that when it's gone, patients do get a prolonged duration of withdrawal with adverse symptoms. So yes, there is a physical dependency that does form with marijuana.
Okay, but I guess when I heard the word opiate disorder, since we were talking about marijuana, I was wondering if there is such a diagnosis as marijuana disorder.
It's a semantical question because
Okay.
there are a lot of substances that have a diagnosis under substance abuse disorder, but aren't explicitly listed as an individual compound. The reason opioid use is because it's so widespread.
Okay, and the reason I asked that, I have a doctor friend that I check with occasionally on these issues, and he's indicated that in his many years of practice, he hasn't seen anyone with, I guess, a marijuana disorder, although with other drugs, you see various disorders, or whatever you would call them, and he hasn't seen that with marijuana. So then my question is, if he hasn't seen it, does it exist?
There are a lot
I
of
guess in his mind it doesn't, but I don't know.
There are a lot of neurologists who will never see a problem with kidney disorder. There are a lot of nephrologists who will never see a neurological problem. It depends on what specialty that you've chosen to pursue, and I'm not sure what specialty your colleague is in. However, if you speak to an addictionologist, there's no question, there's no debate that there is addiction or physical dependency to marijuana.
I didn't know there was something called a dictionologist, so maybe I'll see if I can find one of them. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I do have one question for the panel, law enforcement folks. Have you all ever cooperated with the federal government, federal narcotics, in enforcing any of the Controlled Substances Act provisions here in Kentucky?
Yes, sir. Many times.
Every day.
And part of this bill basically creates a sanctuary state where law enforcement cannot even give information to the federal government about marijuana growth, and if you believe that it's in compliance with state law, you cannot even give information to the federal government. I wonder if you have any comment on that.
Well, in part, I think it's crazy, but that'd be the simplistic term. But yes, sir, that would certainly inhibit investigations. And you know, there's the misnomer that prisons are full of people with marijuana possession. I also operate the drug task force at Bowling Green. The people we go after with marijuana are dealing in tens of 20 or 30 or hundreds of pounds of marijuana. So quite frequently in those sorts of investigations, other drug investigations, we cooperate with both DEA, FBI, and ATF. We, in our task force, have an FBI agent and ATF agent in there. So under this provision, we probably couldn't even talk to them about it.
And you also have to remember that the vast majority of drug enforcement, 90% plus, and I would say on the high end of the 90% plus, is handled in state court. Federal prosecution is minimal at best in regards to drug enforcement. If you look at the courts throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the lifting is done through the prosecution at the state level, not the federal level, with the cooperation of our federal partners.
And you all are aware of the latest guidance from Attorney General Sessions regarding the enforcement of federal laws, correct?
Yes, sir. Some of us met with him recently on that.
Yes, sir. I was privileged to meet with him in June, and he made that crystal clear. Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your presentation today. We are going to adjourn the meeting, and we may come back at a later meeting to vote on this bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Meeting is adjourned.